Wow.
What's up?
I just bought and financed a car through Carvana in minutes.
You? The person who agonized 4 weeks over whether to paint your walls eggshell or off-white bought and financed a car in minutes?
They made it easy. Transparent terms, customizable down and monthly. Didn't even have to do any paperwork.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Hey, have you checked out that spreadsheet I sent you for our dinner options?
Finance your car with Carvana and experience total control. Financing subject to credit approval.
Yeah, sure thing.
Hey, you sold that car yet?
Yeah, sold it to Carvana.
Oh, I thought you were selling to that guy.
The guy who wanted to pay me in foreign currency, no interest, over 36 months? Yeah, no. Carvana gave me an offer in minutes, picked it up, and paid me on the spot. It was so convenient.
Just like that.
Yeah?
No hassle.
None.
That is super convenient. Sell your car to Carvana and swap hassle for convenience. Pickup fees may apply.
It's January 28th, 1917, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
The withdrawal of the U.S. military expedition sent into Mexico under General John J. Pershing to flush out the guerrilla leader Pancho Villa began quietly today in history in 1917, with the Americans keen to downplay what had turned out to be an embarrassing damp squib. The object of the search, Villa himself, was less tactful, quipping, "That Pershing came in like an eagle and leaves now like a wet chicken."
Yeah, and the US military leader who led the US force wasn't too far away from the thoughts of Villa on the issue, because he'd later write that the whole episode would not, quote, be a very inspiring chapter for school children or even grown-ups to contemplate. Having dashed into Mexico with the intention of eating the Mexicans raw, we turned back at the first repulse and are now sneaking home undercover like a whipped cur with its tail between its legs.
I don't know, we're grown-ups contemplating it. Seems like an entertaining story to me. So let's explain who Pancho Villa was and why, at the request of President Wilson, there was an expedition to find him. He was born with a different name. He took the name Pancho Villa, age 16, after a notorious bandit, and began his career as a highway thief, basically. He kind of marketed himself as a sort of Robin Hood character, you know, sharing the spoils with the poor, and built a reputation as a masterful horseman and someone who could persuade others, crucially, to join his gang.
Yeah, and from here, he would go on to become a key figure in the Mexican Revolution, which had begun in 1910 with an uprising against the president, Porfirio Diaz, who had been in power for 31 years at that point. And it sparked a decade. It was all very complicated, obviously. Please go away and read into the Mexican Revolution, because I don't think we're going to do it justice. But it was basically a decade of coups and counter-coups between warring factions to fill that power vacuum that ultimately cost the lives of about 2 million Mexican soldiers and civilians. And Villa was a general in the Revolutionary Army, but not the one that would ultimately prevail. The successful faction were known as the Constitutionalists. They were backed by the US. They were political moderates, and they wanted to create a constitutional democracy a little bit like the USA, so you can see how it was appealing to them. Their leader was a guy called Venustiano Carranza. In the early stage of the conflict, he and Villa had fought on the same side, but the relationship broke down. He was a bourgeois politician. Villa was a radical, kind of warlord. But at a convention between the revolutionary generals, kind of to pave the way forward in autumn 1914, Villa initially emerged as the dominant force in Mexican politics. He even started to assemble a coalition government. And at this point, the US regarded him as the country's de facto leader. But then Carranza successfully led a campaign to defeat Villa's army. The latter stages of this benefited from direct support for Carranza from the US. They saw the winds were changing.
Yeah, so in January 1916, basically to protest the fact that President Woodrow Wilson had begun to throw his support behind Carranza, Villa then executed 16 US citizens at Santa Isabel in northern Mexico. And then on the 9th of March of that same year, Villa then led a band of several hundred guerrillas across the border and raided the town of Columbus, killing another 17 Americans at great cost to himself, it must be said. US troops then pursued the Mexicans and killed about 50 of them on US soil and 70 more once they'd crossed the border into Mexico. But this was a whole trigger for President Wilson to then go, do you know what, enough's enough. We've got to go after this guy and get him.
And that was a change in his relationship, as you've indicated, with the United States, who he had been successfully courting earlier in his career. It's worth actually just talking a little bit about his MO when he was the de facto ruler of northern Mexico, because He had a 10,000-strong revolutionary army at one point, robbing trains to fund it. It was a kind of amazing operation. And he did manage to achieve a lot for the people of northern Mexico. They were minting their own money. They were setting up schools for the poor. He also had more than 40 wives. He would head into a town, find a young beauty and wed her. I think in his mind this was, more noble than pillage.
It's a decent thing to do.
It's a decent thing to do. But a lot of it was obviously highly predatory behaviour at best. However, some of them were obviously proper relationships because many of them then moved into his ranch once he stopped being a revolutionary later. Anyway, this relationship with the United States led to him having a contract with Hollywood at one point, with Mutual Film Studios, who had agreed to document his real-life revolutionary fighting as part of an action movie.
Yeah, he was quite popular because he would allow studios to come and film, and he'd even do retakes if they missed a piece of key action. I do not know how you do a retake in a live battle situation.
Well, he was good on a horse, like I said.
Yeah, he was.
On a horse. Yeah. But that deal actually fell apart after a month, and they ended up fictionalizing his story and restaging it on a Hollywood soundstage. But still, it shows that then to have this, the Pershing expedition pursuing him on the instructions of the president, was quite an about-face.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, the raid on Columbus, New Mexico was quite cinematic. It was like a dawn raid of horsemen, rode into town. They started burning buildings and looting homes. The problem was that Villa's spies had drastically underestimated the numbers of US cavalry stationed in the area. They actually knew that there was US cavalry there, and that was actually part of the appeal. Villa's men desperately needed supplies, but there were far more cavalrymen there than they'd anticipated, and so Villa's raiders were quickly driven back over the border. They lost about 67 men. In the US, on the aftermath of this, there was intense anger about territorial integrity, essentially, because actually the US Army had been tipped off about a possible raid. The Villa's men were sort of massing on the other side of the border, but because they weren't allowed to cross the border, US Army scouts had not been able to go and check this out for themselves and monitor them, and nor could the US cavalry pursue them once they crossed the Mexican border. And this was a subject of extreme anger in the US. So in a statement to the public, President Wilson announced that there was going to be an expedition over the border, but he said specifically, it can and will be done in entirely friendly aid to the constituted authorities of Mexico and with scrupulous respect for the sovereignty of that republic. And indeed, there was consent, albeit very, very grudging, from President Carranza.
Yeah, so Pershing assembled this expeditionary army of over 100,000 people. It was composed of cavalry, infantry, logistical support trains, and really early aircraft. The stuff that I was reading was trying to portray it as some kind of a military success, insofar as this was the first time that the US had projected its military force across its own borders. And so the stuff I was reading was saying this proved to be valuable experience in, projecting American military power.
Yeah, I mean, I think that development of aeroplanes as a weapon of war, those planes couldn't carry much at this point in the way of munitions or supplies or clothes. So what would you do when you got there anyway? Even if you did manage to find him, like it's just you in the plane. Yeah. But I suppose you needed to go through those stages of working out exactly what you would do and evolving what military action from a plane might look like. And this was a useful exercise for the United States on something that didn't actually matter hugely. It looked like they'd had a reaction to their own people being killed. It was something that Americans were behind. But at the same time, in a way, the action was more important than the result. Like, Pancho Villa wasn't going to keep coming back into America and killing people, was he?
Yeah, I mean, this was the first real action for the 1st Aero Squadron. At that point, part of the army, there was no Air Force yet. And, there has been kind of an attempt to put a positive spin on it, saying that the bad condition of the planes and their shoddy build and poor performance was a wake-up call for the US. And so the Air Force was already undergoing reforms when the US would go on to enter World War I. But, I mean, that's really a bit of PR for the US because, all that happened was that they discovered their planes sucked. Part of the problem was that it was mountainous terrain, which was difficult from the ground already because it was very hard to navigate, very cold at night. But also the 8 biplanes that belonged to the 1st Aero Squadron were unable to fly high enough to go over some of the ranges. They couldn't get over some of the mountains. That was one issue. What was more successful, another first, was the first use of motorised trucks to convey supplies. This would be repeated with success in World War I.
By most measures, this expedition was a failure. Villa's forces were scattered. That was good, but he wasn't captured, and he remained in the field until 1920 when he brokered this sort of amnesty with yet another Mexican government and retired to a hacienda in Canutillo.
Yeah, retired in his early 40s. I was thinking about that in his lifestyle. Like, So weird, isn't it, to be a massive revolutionary leader and think you're really going places, and then in your 40s just be like his life was living under intense security and occasionally driving out of a compound.
Well, he had 40 wives to tend to as well, so he would have had...
One for each year of his life.
Yeah.
Well, he'd got it because the new Mexican president, Adolfo de la Huerta, was another friend-turned-enemy of Carranza, and he had just overthrown him in a coup, in fact. And de la Huerta made him a very savvy offer. Live freely, here's a free estate, please stay out of politics forever. But, he couldn't quite resist. Apparently Villa had started talking about running in the 1924 election, and he was assassinated in 1923. So he didn't get to enjoy his 40 wives and his hacienda for very long.
Meantime, in 1926, someone took Villa's head off his body from his coffin. And only in 1984 was his death mask returned to Mexico. Weirdly, it had been the property of Radford School, a girls' private school in El Paso. It's a sort of offbeat choice for a lacrosse trophy, isn't it? Apparently, they'd had a head who liked the idea. Oh dear, that was bad choice of words, wasn't it? They'd had a principal, who was a fan of curios and had intended to establish a museum there in the girls' school, and this was one of the exhibits.
Incidentally, Villa's last words are possibly my favourite last words of all time. He said, apparently, "It can't end like this. Tell them I said something," which I can imagine being my own last words.
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
At Oxford, it's like a huge deal with a piper and kilns and like a ceilidh afterwards.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.
The difference between ordinary and extraordinary is that little word, extra. On the Growth Mindset podcast, I dive into the psychology of human potential and what the science says about self-improvement to give you that little extra. According to experts, your potential is not sitting under a rock waiting for you to finally trip over it. Destiny is merely a function of dedication and hard work. So leave your inner chakra at the door, put the astrology chart down, and stop waiting for something or someone to fix your life. Take responsibility for yourself and give me a listen on the Growth Mindset Psychology of Self-Improvement podcast.